Okay, so this is a video that discusses export controls and embargoes, which is an important topic when you're doing international transactions because virtually all countries, and certainly all the industrialized countries, have export controls and embargoes. So let's just take a look at how this works without getting too detailed about it, but just to get a basic understanding. So first of all, the point to be noted here is that when you do an international transaction, basically this is a private contract between and among two or more parties, and they enter into this contract voluntarily. But the problem is that many times these contracts can involve issues that the governments of these countries are concerned about. They regulate these contracts. So there could be issues or contracts dealing with criminals, terrorists, the enemies of a country, or contracts that simply violate policies and international or domestic objectives of that country, such as threatening their national security. So the country tries to regulate or at least oversee what these contracts are doing. So most developed countries have these kinds of regulations, and many less developed countries have them as well. And most of the time they're based on national security concerns. So originally these export restrictions developed during the Cold War in the former Soviet Union, when basically there were prohibitions on trading with communist countries, so China, former Soviet Union, etc. And the Western countries, United States, European countries, had these kinds of restrictions. Today, those restrictions, you still see elements of those philosophies and restrictions in today's export regulations, but they also have, these restrictions have developed in response to other international developments. So if you look at the constitutional authority for the federal government to regulate this area, it's vested in the first article of the United States Constitution that gives Congress a power to regulate commerce with the foreign nations. And there are basically several statutes which have been enacted under that under that constitutional authority. The Export Administration Act of 1979, which periodically expires and they have to renew it, the Arms Export Control Act, and the Trading with the Enemy Act. So if you're doing international trade, especially with the United States, you will see references to these statutes. And there are basically two departments in the federal government that oversee these statutes. They are the U.S. Department of State, that has jurisdiction over international traffic in arms regulations, or ITAR. So this regulates the export of arms and munitions. And the U.S. Department of Commerce, which issues and regulates the Export Administration Regulations, or EAR. And those are administered by Department of Commerce and specifically the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. So we're not going to talk about the ITAR regulations because this is not a course dealing with arms regulation, but we are going to look at the Department of Commerce EAR regulations, which has more of a civilian, less military application than the ITAR regs. But you will see both. You will see both of them if you're doing international transactions. Okay, so originally this regulatory philosophy developed during the Cold War approach between the West and the communist countries, and specifically former Soviet Union. And the controls were what we refer to as product and destination controls, meaning that you are not allowed to ship certain things to certain countries. And the remnants of that philosophy still exist today when you see specific country destinations on a banned list, and North Korea is certainly one of them. Iran has been another. And as you know from the treaty with Iran, negotiations, John Kerry's been holding with Iran, those sanctions may soon be lifted if both countries agree on that, and the other countries who were part of that negotiation. Cuba was on the list until just this past May rescinded Cuba's designation as state sponsor of terrorism. Now you can see the reason they're on the list. They were considered a state sponsor of terrorism. The objectives today, so you see the remnants of that philosophy with these kind of country destination prohibitions. But the philosophy today has evolved beyond that and has focused on really more development of weapons of mass destruction and regional conflicts and international terrorism, all of which are big issues, as we speak at this very moment. What the government does is basically inform sellers of goods of what these policy objectives are. And then you basically self-regulate and self-determine whether your conduct or your contract or your shipment is in violation of these regulations and policy objectives. So to some extent, it's a self-regulating area. And if your product, for example, falls within a area of concern to the government, then you may have to get permission from Department of Commerce. You may have to get a license. And selling nuclear reactors to China would certainly be one of those areas. Nuclear reactors, commercial nuclear reactors that generate power, is certainly something that would be beneficial to China because of its huge power demands and the fact that it's relying so heavily on coal, which is a heavy pollutant and involves global warming, or at least climate change. So there is there's a desire to approve these, but it's just something that the government wants to know about, wants to review, and you'll have to get a license. The key concept here is that you need to know who your customer is. Who are you selling this to? And is the person, the company, the entity you're selling it to someone who is on a blacklist, a prohibited list? And the government issues these prohibited lists or blacklists, and it's really your obligation to know and to check who are on these lists. As I said earlier, Iran has been certainly one of those countries, and there was actually a serious event back in 2011 where supposedly there was a hit team that was dispatched by Iran to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. And so this is, the fact that foreign hit teams would be in the United States targeting government officials from other countries is very offensive to the United States, and especially when Saudi Arabia is considered an ally of the United States. So when this assassination attempt failed and all the activities behind it were discovered, additional sanctions were placed on Iranian energy companies. So it's kind of a retaliation for conduct that the U.S. deemed unacceptable. The Arab Spring a number of years ago resulted in a number of multilateral sanctions against Syria and Libya. So these sanctions, again, are used to promote international policy objectives. ISIS, or ISIL, as you know, is a terrorist group. They are not a country. I guess they maybe have proclaimed they are some kind of caliphate or country, but officially in the United Nations or elsewhere, they're not considered a country. They're a terrorist organization. So sanctions and export controls are placed on ISIS. The problem is partly that these regulations are pretty complicated. Um, it's easy to run afoul of them. It has been called a Byzantine amalgam of regulations issued by departments of commerce and the State Department. And there's an example of a British C-17 on the ground in Australia could not get the parts it needed for repair because U.S. law required the Australians to seek permission before doing the repair. And of course, certainly Australia and Great Britain are allies of the United States. So it's kind of a messy thing. And big companies certainly will have people in the company who are experts in this area. And smaller companies that are doing international business need to rely on consulting firms or lawyers to make sure they don't run afoul of the regulations. So let's talk about the Bureau of Industry and Security. This is a law enforcement agency, and they're authorized to investigate and pursue criminal and administrative sanctions against export violators. And their mission is basically to keep items out of the hands of weapons proliferators and terrorists. They work closely with the Department of Justice to impose criminal sanctions for violations, fines, and work with the FBI and Department of Homeland Security. Criminal penalties can reach 20 years of imprisonment, $1 million per violation. They also violators may have their export privileges revoked. And some of these violations involve strict liability, meaning that your mind, your state of mind, or your intent has nothing to do with it. Your conduct is enough to constitute the violation, and for you to say, oh, I didn't know it was a violation, is not a defense. So other violations require knowledge or should have known, and I would say right here, whatever a law or regulation says something about knowingly or knowledge, you should always read it to mean or should have known. So you have the obligation to put some effort into finding out what these things are, and it's not enough simply to say, I just didn't know. So there's an important distinction between strict liability and other violations, which is based strictly on conduct, versus other violations that require some knowledge. There are a number of BIS Field Offices around the United States. And let's talk a few minutes about what constitutes an export. So this is an important point that oftentimes comes as a surprise to many people. An export is basically anything that is sent from the United States to a foreign destination. And anything is anything. So certainly if you carry something or ship something, a computer or a laser or something, that clearly is covered. But it also covers anything you send, for example, a fax. Or you take a laptop overseas and it has confidential information on the hard drive. Your flash drive would be an export if it has, confidential information on there. Anything you upload to the internet. Simply holding a video conference where you're discussing things and maybe showing PowerPoints or whiteboard pictures. These are all exports. They're all exports, and so the means by which the item or information is transported is totally irrelevant. This fact that something is leaving the United States. And the fact that you take it there for 2 days and then bring it back doesn't correct the violation. So, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I had this flash drive in my pocket. Oh, so now you've exported it. Well, I'm coming back from Frankfurt, Germany, or South Korea, and I'm only going to be there 2 days, so it'll be all right. I mean, technically, if you meet all the other criteria of the export, it is it's a violation. The point is the export and the re-importation of the item does not cure the violation. And then, of course, we have this notion of a deemed export. And a deemed export is where the information, for example, does not explicitly leave the United States at the moment of the violation. What happens is you have the foreign minister of India visiting to the United States, and he is touring an internet company, and in the course of the tour, he sees information dealing with cyber technology and cyber worms that's being developed for the CIA, which they may use on Syria or North Korea. Well, the fact that that information goes into his head, and the fact that he is leaving the United States because he's there on a temporary visa, is enough to be deemed an export. So we call that a deemed export. It's not a physical flash drive or laptop, but he has now received prohibited information, and because he's not a permanent resident here, he is deemed that is deemed an export. So again, it's a very broad concept. People are very surprised to hear this, but that's the way it works. Now, so there are several steps you go through to determine what you need to do when you're going to export something. And the purpose here is not to make you an expert on exports, but just to give you a kind of a quick, brief overview of the concept so that you have some familiarity with it if it comes up. If you're doing an export, you have to get an export control classification number, an ECCN, and that's an example of what one would look like, a number, a letter, and then several numbers. And these things come out of the Export Administration Regs, EARs, and the first number is basically a category. So whatever you're shipping out falls into one of these categories. It might be nuclear materials or electronics or sensors and lasers, propulsion systems, and that's what the first number. So here the number 3 means it's some kind of electronics. And this is what the actual BIS website looks like for the Commerce Control List categories. And then within each of those 10 categories, you have the 5 product groups, which you see are designated by the letters, the A, B, C, D, E. Systems, equipment, components, material, software, technology. So then you pick the letter that your item falls into. And then you basically have to get the rest of these numbers, and not everything is prohibited. So low-level technology consumer goods like hair dryers or simple laptop computers are not really going to be prohibited. All right, so after classifying the item, then you look for the reasons for control and country destination. And again, this is kind of the older philosophy, and you see here the embargoed countries, and Iran presumably to be eliminated from that list in a not too distant future. Limited embargoes for Iraq and Rwanda. So this is a big issue. Who actually receives the export? And this is really a critical part of this whole analysis, because the Treasury Department maintains the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And you hear this come up all the time when you're doing international work. And OFAC basically issues a list of individuals and organizations deemed to represent restricted countries or known to be involved in terrorism or narcotics. And you need to know if the person you're dealing with is on that list. And OFAC updates these lists periodically. It's actually pretty easy to search it. And when they do updates, you can get on an email list. They'll send you an update. So it's not too hard to put things in there, except the problem is sometimes the spelling. So, you know, when you're dealing with an Asian or a Russian or Kazakh or something like that, where a different alphabet is transcribed into pinyin or you know, Roman alphabet, these spellings, you know, phonetically can be a little bit different, but so you may have to dig a little bit to make sure you're covering this. They have a list of specially designated nationals, or SDNs, and blocked persons list. Here, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, the U.S. formally declares Boko Haram and Nigerian Islamic militant groups as foreign terrorist groups. Now, at that moment, when I put this slide in here, Boko Haram was hardly even known by anybody. But since then, you remember he's kidnapped all these teenage girls, and the president's wife came out and bring the girls home, and you know he's been engaged in a fair amount of terrorist activity, and has gotten, you know, I think he's even aligned himself with Al Qaeda at these recently, either Al Qaeda or ISIL. So you want to check to see who's on that list. Certainly, when Russia started meddling in Ukraine, it raised a number of issues. And these penalties are, here's information about civil penalties and enforcement information. This is all available on the website. But when Russia started fooling around in Ukraine after the Olympics, you know, a lot of people were listed on these lists, being prohibited to work with. You can see here, here's an order that President Obama signed, finding that the actions, policies of the government of the Russian Federation, including purported annexation of Crimea and its use of force in Ukraine, continue to undermine democratic processes and institutions in Ukraine, threaten its peace, security, stability, sovereignty, etc., accordingly I hereby order. And so here, you know, to the extent you had private contracts, now you've got the federal government interfering with these contracts, and you may be prohibited from doing that. And here are specific individuals that were listed as a result of Russian conduct. Yevgeny Bushman, Vladimir Zaborov, he's the first deputy chairman. And the idea here, these were people who were advising Putin. And the United States felt were directly involved in this activity in Ukraine and Crimea. The new U.S. sanctions target 20 officials, including senior Russians and cronies who hold significant influence in the Russian system, as well as one bank that holds significant resources. The bank was listed by the U.S. Department of Treasury as Bank Russia. The individuals named by the Treasury include Putin allies, both in Kremlin and in business. So the idea here is, you know, not just to go after his top advisors, but also some of the oligarchs at the top who are benefiting and making a lot of money from these and other policies. Others are named as members of the government's inner circle. He was Putin's personal banker. The latest round hit significant economic interests that are fairly close to the ruling circles in Moscow. Russia responded with sanctions, so kind of like a trade war. Now they respond with sanctions. They named 9 U.S. officials and lawmakers, including the Speaker of the House of Representatives, which at the time was John Boehner, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, Senators John McCain, Robert Menendez, Daniel Coates, Mary Landrieu, according to a list published by the Russian Foreign Ministry. Boehner's spokesman, Michael Steele, said the lawmaker was proud to be included on a list of those willing to stand against Putin's aggression. McCain responded, I guess this means my spring break in Siberia is off, my Gazprom stock is lost, and my secret bank account in Moscow is frozen, all of which is pretty ironic because I'm sure he doesn't have a secret bank account in Moscow. Nevertheless, I will cease my efforts on behalf of the freedom, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea. And here the bankruptcy was controlled by Yuri Kovalchuk and is the 17th largest bank in Russia. And this is just one example. And you can see, you can search OFAC. There are lots of different ways. Here you can search Boko Haram, and he came up pretty easily. So, so fourth, what is the export used for? Well, regardless of what the item is, part of the question is, what is it going to be used for? Now, anything that constitutes a weapon of mass destruction is going to be on the banned list. So nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, anything of that nature will be off limits, and the burden is on you to know your customer. And this is what it's called, know your customer rule. You have to know who you're dealing with. You have to do the due diligence to find out who is getting this product. And it may not always be the person on the contract. Now, if there are no red flags, and this is what we call them, red flags, then it's okay to proceed based on the information you have. But if there are red flags, then you have an affirmative duty to investigate. Who is the end user of this product? What is the end use of the product or the country of ultimate destination? So, willful ignorance is not a defense. It is not a defense. It is called the ostrich rule, where people intentionally say, oh, don't tell me, I don't want to know. If I don't know, then I can't be guilty or I can't be liable. Prosecutors know this. It's called the ostrich defense, and it is not a defense. Because, again, if the test is knowledge, then the question is, should you have known through some reasonable due diligence? So the procedure is, first of all, are there red flags? And if there are red flags, then you have a duty to inquire further, and do not self-blind. Intentional ignorance is not a defense. So some examples are, the customer is reluctant to offer information about the end use of the product. They don't want to tell you what they're going to use it for. Or the guy buying the item doesn't match what his business. The example is, he runs a bakery in Afghanistan, but he wants to buy high-intensity lasers. What do high-intensity lasers have to do with a bakery? I mean, it's clearly a front. The lasers are going somewhere else. Now, they do everything in cash when people normally finance the transaction. The customer has no idea about the product or how to operate the product, but I still want it. I still want that high-intensity laser. We don't want any training on how to use it, or we don't want any maintenance. In other words, anything that kind of exposes who they are is something, it raises red flags. For example, the terrorists who commandeered the airplanes for 9/11 and flew them into the Pentagon and into the World Trade buildings in New York City. They were taking flying lessons. All they wanted to know was how to fly the airplane. They didn't want to know how to land it. They didn't want to know how to take off. I mean, it's kind of strange to take flying lessons and say, I don't want to know how to land the airplane. The customer is evasive about the use of the product or ultimate destination. So These are the kinds of red flags. If you sense this, it means you need to investigate. And these concepts are right here on the BIS website.